For 25 years, one man refused to believe Microsoft had changed its heart. While the rest of the technology world cheered a new, friendlier Microsoft, one that put its arm around Linux and said, "We love you now," Linus Torvalds kept his guard up. He never bought the hug, he never trusted the motive, and for that, he was called paranoid, bitter, a relic of old grudges who could not let the 1990s go. "Move on," people said. "Microsoft loves open source now. Get with the times, old man." Well, in May of 2026, Microsoft stood on a stage in Minneapolis and quietly confirmed something that would have been unthinkable when Torvalds started. More than 2/3 of all the customer computing power running inside Azure, Microsoft's own cloud, the crown jewel of the entire company, does not run Windows. It runs Linux. The free operating system a Microsoft chief executive once called a cancer is now the thing holding up the house that Microsoft built. Not a corner of it. 2 out of every 3 bricks. Linus Torvalds did not predict that Microsoft would fall. He predicted something far stranger and far harder to see coming. He predicted, in his own careful way, that Microsoft would end up needing the very thing it tried to destroy. That it would be shaped by open source more than open source would ever be shaped by it. And I will show you the moment on that same stage when a man from the Linux Foundation said the quiet part out loud and made the whole room laugh because everyone finally understood the joke was on Microsoft. But first, you need to understand who this man is and why nobody believed him for so long. There is a number that tells you everything about how impossible this outcome once seemed. When Linus Torvalds first announced his project in 1991, he wrote a message to a small group of computer hobbyists. He called it, and these are close to his words, just a hobby. He said it would not be big and professional. That was the entire ambition. A young Finnish student, 21 years old, building a free operating system in his spare time because the ones available were either too expensive or too limited for a student to touch. He gave it away. Anyone could download it, read every line, change it, and share it. He asked for nothing in return, except that people keep it free. There was no company behind it, no marketing budget, no sales force, no plan to conquer anything. Just a student, a keyboard, and a conviction that software should belong to the people who use it. It was, by every measure that mattered in the boardrooms of the day, the least threatening thing imaginable. Today, it runs the world. It runs the servers behind ChatGPT, which by Microsoft's own admission, spreads across more than 10 million computing cores and answers 1 billion questions a day. It runs GitHub, the largest home for computer code on Earth, which Microsoft paid $7.5 billion to own. It runs Microsoft's own Office software in the cloud, the very productivity tools the company sells to the world. The project that was never going to be big and professional now quietly powers the most professional operations of the very company that once declared war on it. Hold that contrast in your mind, because the story of how we got here is not a story of luck. It is a story of one stubborn man's design, and I will get to that design in a moment, because it is the reason none of the rest could be undone. Steve Ballmer, who ran Microsoft from 2000 until 2014, sat down with a Chicago newspaper reporter in 2001 and called Linux a cancer. He said it attaches itself, in an intellectual property sense, to everything it touches. He meant that the free software was a kind of infection, something that would creep into a company and destroy its ability to sell software the old, profitable way. Ballmer reportedly viewed the people who used Linux as little better than thieves. That was the tone set at the very top of the most powerful software company in the world. And Microsoft did not just talk. It had a strategy, and people in the open source world had a name for it. 3 words that became almost a warning chant. Embrace, extend, extinguish. The idea was that when Microsoft could not simply crush a competitor, it would embrace the competitor's technology, extend it with its own private editions that only worked the Microsoft way, and then, once everyone depended on the Microsoft version, extinguish the original. People had watched it happen to real companies whose names have now nearly faded from memory. Netscape, which once owned the web browser. WordPerfect, which once owned word processing. Lotus, which once owned the spreadsheet. Embraced, extended, and then gone. So when Microsoft turned its eyes toward Linux, the veterans of that era did not see a handshake. They saw the opening move of a familiar and deadly game. Then, in 2007, Microsoft made its threat explicit. The company claimed that Linux and other open-source programs violated more than 200 of its patents, a move clearly designed to frighten businesses away from using free software to make them afraid that touching Linux might get them sued. And this is the closest thing to the warning in the title of this video, so let me be precise about it, because it matters. Torvalds did not panic, and he did not fold. He fired back that if Microsoft had a real case, it would simply show everyone the patents and gloat about it, rather than keeping a secret list and refusing to say what was on it. He told them, in effect, to put up or shut up. He was daring the most powerful company in software to prove its threat in public, and he already knew it never would. That was not bravado. He understood the ground he was standing on, and Microsoft's lawyers were counting on ordinary people not understanding it. Around the middle of the 2010s, Microsoft changed its tune completely. A new chief executive, Satya Nadella, took over and famously declared that Microsoft loves Linux. The company joined the Linux Foundation, the very organization that stewards the project. It built Linux compatibility directly into Windows through a feature called the Windows Subsystem for Linux, which let a person run a real Linux system inside a window on their Windows desktop. No tricks and no emulation. The genuine thing running side by side with Windows. It placed full Linux distributions inside its own Windows store, right next to its own products. It even began contributing its own code to the Linux kernel that Torvalds still oversaw. And in 2020, Microsoft's own president, a man named Brad Smith, stood up at an event and said plainly that Microsoft had been on the wrong side of history when open source exploded, and that he could say that about himself, personally, to almost everyone watching. This looked like peace. Reconciliation? The confession could hardly have been more complete. The enemy had not merely surrendered, it had converted, and was now preaching the new faith louder than anyone. But not everyone trusted the turnaround, and this is the moment that defined Linus Torvalds for the next decade. In 2019, at a Linux developers conference, a veteran journalist asked him directly whether Microsoft was trying to take over Linux. And Torvalds, along with the other senior kernel developers around him, gave an answer that people have argued about ever since. They agreed, all of them, that Microsoft would surely love to control Linux. Of course it would. Any company would. But they were not worried about it. Not even a little. Torvalds went further, saying he had come to genuinely like the Microsoft engineers he met at conferences, that they seemed happy working on Linux, and that he had set aside the old anti-Microsoft reflexes as a joke that was no longer funny. His calm was not the same as trust. He was not relaxed because he had decided Microsoft was good. He was relaxed because he had built something that did not require Microsoft to be good. That is the design I promised you, and it is the single most important thing in this entire story. Torvalds built Linux under a legal license called the GPL. And that license does something close to magical. It says that anyone who takes Linux and builds on it must, by law, share their changes back with everyone else under the very same free terms. You cannot take Linux, lock it in a box, add your secret ingredients, and sell that box as your own private product. The license flatly forbids it. So it does not matter how big, or how rich, or how hostile a company might be. It does not matter whether Microsoft loves Linux this year or hates it next year. Microsoft can never own it because the rules Torvalds wrote more than 30 years ago make ownership structurally impossible. The lock was built in to the foundation, and the foundation cannot be pried apart. This is also why Ballmer's cancer line, for all its venom, was in one sense completely accurate, just backwards. He said Linux attaches itself, in an intellectual property sense, to everything it touches. He meant it as a threat, a warning to stay away. But he was describing the mechanism that would one day make his own company dependent. Once Microsoft's cloud started touching Linux, it could never fully let go, and it could never fully own what it was holding. Ballmer saw the trap. He just could not imagine that his own company would be the one to walk into it. That was the ground Torvalds had been standing on all along, back when he dared Microsoft to show its patents. He had never handed anyone the keys because he had forged the lock himself. Compare that to what happened with GitHub. Microsoft simply bought GitHub outright with a check for $7.5 billion. Because GitHub was a company, and companies can be bought. When that deal was announced, a wave of unease went through the open source world, and some developers packed up their code and moved it to rival services in protest, because they understood something instinctively. A company is a set of keys, and whoever holds the keys holds the power. But Linux is not a company. There is no owner to pay, no stock to purchase, no boardroom to capture, no chief executive to lean on. There is quite literally nothing to buy. You cannot acquire a principal. You cannot write a check for a license that belongs equally to everyone and to no one. And that single distinction, the difference between a thing you can own and a thing you cannot, is about to become the entire point of this story. So, let us return to that stage in Minneapolis in May of 2026 and watch the Vindication arrive in real time. Microsoft's Brendan Burns, a co-founder of a major open source project and now a senior Azure executive, stood up and announced that Microsoft was releasing its own Linux distribution called Azure Linux 4.0 as a full, general-purpose product for its customers. Read that sentence again slowly. Microsoft, the company whose chief executive called Linux a cancer, is now building and shipping its own version of Linux, not tolerating it, not supporting it grudgingly, manufacturing it, stamping the Microsoft name on it, and offering it as a core piece of its business, right alongside the paid Windows it spent decades protecting. And in the audience sat Jim Zemlin, the head of the Linux Foundation. When Microsoft had first joined his organization years earlier, there had been a wave of suspicion, a conspiracy theory that Microsoft was somehow infiltrating the Linux world in order to undermine it from within, which was, of course, precisely the kind of fear Torvalds had been mocked for even seeming to entertain. So when Microsoft announced that it was now shipping its very own Linux distribution, Zemlin could not resist. He reminded everyone of that old conspiracy theory, the one that said Microsoft joining the foundation was a plot against open source, and then he gestured at what had come to pass. And here you are, he said in effect, announcing that you are shipping a Linux distribution. That's amazing. The room laughed. But that laugh carried 25 years of history inside it. The company that came to bury Linux had instead been quietly absorbed by it. And it does not stop at the cloud. Just 2 weeks later, in June of 2026, at its Build conference, Microsoft announced that it was bringing more than 75 classic Linux commands directly into Windows itself, running natively so that developers could use the everyday tools of the free operating system without ever leaving the paid one. One technology publication put it more bluntly than Microsoft ever would dare to. It ran a headline declaring that Microsoft had finally admitted Linux won. Sit with the full shape of that for a second. Linux now runs most of Microsoft's cloud. Microsoft ships its own Linux. Microsoft has stitched Linux commands into the guts of Windows. And Microsoft owns the single largest warehouse of open source code that has ever existed. Every one of those is a place where Microsoft did not extend its own way of doing things onto the world. It is a place where the world's way of doing things extended itself onto Microsoft. The old chant was embrace, extend, extinguish. What happened was the reverse. Open source embraced Microsoft, extended into it, and quietly extinguished the idea that Microsoft's way was the only way. Microsoft is more valuable and more powerful today than it has ever been in its history. It did not lose. In a very real sense, it made a brilliant decision. It stopped fighting a war it could not possibly win, and instead, it learned to build on the winning foundation. And it has made staggering amounts of money doing that. The engineers at Microsoft, who work on open source today, are, by every account, genuine and skilled and sincere in their work. When Torvalds said in 2019 that he had come to respect them, he meant it. And he was right to. Microsoft did not embrace Linux out of love. It embraced Linux because, in the end, it had no other choice. The economics of modern computing, the cloud, artificial intelligence, The vast server farms that quietly run everything you touch. All of it runs better and cheaper on Linux, and Microsoft's own paying customers demanded it. The free project had simply become too essential to fight any longer. Torvalds never claimed Microsoft would one day become good. He built something that would be safe whether Microsoft was good or not. And that is the entire difference between hoping your rival will change and building a thing your rival cannot break. He chose the second one back in 1991, long before he had any idea who would eventually come for it. So when you hear that a Microsoft executive once called Linux a cancer, and then you learn that Microsoft today runs on Linux, ships Linux, and has built Linux into the very heart of Windows, understand what you are looking at. You are looking at the vindication of a man who was told for a quarter of a century that he was living in the past. Linus Torvalds never needed Microsoft to fail. He needed Linux to stay free and stay independent and stay impossible for anyone to own. And he made sure of it. With a license and a principle, he refused to compromise, no matter how friendly or how fierce the pressure grew. The project that was never going to be big and professional now holds up the most professional company on Earth. And the man they called Paranoid turned out to be the only person in the room who truly understood what he had built and why it could never be taken from him. If this story of one stubborn engineer outlasting the most powerful company in software is the kind you want more of, then stay with this channel.